The auction hammer falls, lot 1047. A Fabergé egg, lot 1048. A Severs porcelain dinner service, 120 pieces, lot 1049. Renaissance furniture, Louis XV, carved and gilded, May 1977. Inside Mentmore Towers, everything is for sale. Paintings ripped from walls, tapestries rolled and tagged, chandeliers lowered from ceilings that took craftsmen months to plaster and paint. The house is being gutted, room by room, piece by piece. This isn't bankruptcy. The Rothschilds are still among the wealthiest families on earth. This is choice. A calculated decision that wealth matters more than legacy. That profit trumps preservation. That a house built to prove permanence can be abandoned when the tax bill gets inconvenient. The workers who carved these ceilings are long dead. The servants who polished these floors never owned anything close to what's being sold today. And now, in 3 days of bidding, a century of craftsmanship will scatter across the globe. One question hangs in the empty halls. If the Rothschilds won't fight to save this, what does that say about everything it was supposed to represent? This is the story of Mentmore Towers, a mansion built in the 1850s by Baron Mayer de Rothschild, one of the wealthiest men in Victorian England. It rises from the Buckinghamshire countryside like a Renaissance palace transplanted from Florence. Over 200 rooms, towers that scrape the sky, interiors that made visiting royalty stop and stare. For nearly a century, Mentmore symbolized everything the Rothschilds wanted the world to believe about them. That they had arrived. That their money had bought not just luxury but legitimacy. That a Jewish banking family could build something as grand as any English duke and demand to be treated as equals. But beneath the marble floors and gilded ceilings lies a more complicated truth. Mentmore was built by men whose names no one recorded. It was maintained by servants who earned in a year what a single chandelier cost. It was designed to project permanence, yet abandoned when keeping it became financially inconvenient. The family that built it to prove they belonged walked away when the tax laws changed and the house became a liability instead of an asset. This is not a simple story of villainy or virtue. It's a story about ambition and exploitation, about beauty and cost, about what people build when they're desperate to be accepted and what they're willing to sacrifice when acceptance doesn't come with the benefits they expected. This is the scandalous fall of Mentmore Towers. The Rothschild mansion that was built to last forever and abandoned within a lifetime. This is the story of who built it, who paid for it, and what happened when the dream died. Mayer de Rothschild inherited a banking empire, but he could not inherit acceptance. Born in 1818 in Frankfurt, raised in London, educated in the mechanisms of international finance, he commanded resources that rivaled monarchs. Yet English society kept him at arm's length. His invitations came with conditions. His wealth was acknowledged, his presence tolerated, but the invisible line between old money and new, between Christian aristocracy and Jewish finance, remained unbreachable. So Mayer decided to build something so magnificent, so undeniably grand, that the line would have to move. In the early 1850s, he began purchasing land in Buckinghamshire, a county thick with estates owned by England's oldest families. The site he chose sat on a ridge near the village of Mentmore, visible for miles, a statement before the first stone was even laid. The problem was simple and insurmountable. The Rothschilds were new, not in the sense of decades, but in the sense that mattered to English aristocracy, centuries. The great families traced their lineage to Norman conquest, to medieval knights, to royal grants of land that predated the printing press. The Rothschilds traced theirs to a ghetto in Frankfurt where Mayer's grandfather had operated a small money-lending business from a narrow house marked with a red shield. Within 2 generations, the family had become the most powerful banking dynasty in Europe. They financed governments. They underwrote wars. They moved gold across borders when no one else could. But they could not move the social boundaries that kept them perpetually outside. Mayer felt this acutely. He attended the right clubs, or tried to. Some refused him membership outright. Others admitted him but made it clear he was a guest, not a brother. He was invited to country house parties, but always as the banker, the useful connection, never quite as an equal. His children would face the same walls. His grandchildren might, if he played this correctly, break through. That was the wager. Build something so undeniably magnificent that future generations would forget the family had ever been excluded. The land he purchased near Mentmore cost roughly £10,000, a significant sum but nothing compared to what would follow. The site offered everything he needed. Elevation so the house would command views across the Vale of Aylesbury, proximity to London, close enough for convenience, far enough for privacy, and neighbours. The Duke of Buckingham's estate lay a few miles south. The Rothschild cousins at Waddesdon would build their own palace nearby years later. This was territory where power lived, and Mayer intended to plant his flag in the centre of it. The architectural vision came next. Not English Gothic, which would look like imitation. Not French chateau, which would seem foreign. Italian Renaissance. Classical, cultivated, a style that whispered education and taste rather than shouting nouveau rich desperation. Mayer wanted a house that felt inevitable, as though it had always belonged on that ridge, as though the Rothschilds had always belonged in England. To design Mentmore, Mayer turned to Joseph Paxton, the man who had just electrified London with the Crystal Palace. Paxton was not a trained architect in the traditional sense. He was a gardener who had risen through talent and audacity, designing greenhouses that pushed glass and iron to their structural limits. The Crystal Palace, his masterpiece for the Great Exhibition of 1851, had proven he could think on a scale that left establishment architects behind. Mayer wanted that ambition. He wanted a house that looked like a Renaissance palazzo, but functioned with Victorian modernity. Paxton accepted the commission and set to work designing a structure that would marry Italian grandeur with English innovation, a palace that would announce the Rothschilds had not only arrived, but surpassed the competition. Paxton studied Italian precedents obsessively. He examined engravings of Florentine palaces, measured proportions, analyzed the relationship between height and width, between solid wall and window opening. The result was a design that borrowed heavily from the Villa Farnese and other Renaissance models, but adapted them for English climate and Victorian expectations. The central block would rise 3 stories, topped with a tower that extended another 2 levels. The facade would be symmetrical, balanced, with rusticated stonework on the ground floor, giving way to smoother ashlar above. Windows would be tall, evenly spaced, their proportions calculated to create visual harmony. But Paxton was not content with mere imitation. He incorporated modern materials and systems that Italian builders 3 centuries earlier could never have imagined. The roof would be supported by iron trusses, hidden behind stone parapets, but allowing for larger internal spaces without the need for load-bearing walls throughout. The glass-domed ceiling above the entrance hall would flood the interior with light, while demonstrating the same structural principles that made the Crystal Palace possible. Heating, lighting, plumbing all would be threaded through the building during construction, integrated into the design, rather than added as afterthoughts. The collaboration between Mayer and Paxton was intense and sometimes contentious. Mayer wanted opulence, Paxton wanted elegance. The two are not always compatible. Mayer pushed for more ornamentation, richer materials, larger rooms. Paxton argued for restraint, for proportion, for spaces that would feel grand without tipping into vulgarity. They compromised repeatedly. The entrance hall would be vast but not cluttered. The staircases would be monumental but not overwrought. The proportions would speak for themselves. Paxton also understood the practical reality that Mayer faced. This house had to work as a year-round residence, not a summer retreat. English winters were cold and damp. Rooms had to be heated efficiently. Chimneys had to draw properly. Servants had to move through the house without disrupting family and guests. So Paxton designed dual circulation systems, grand staircases for public display, hidden staircases for staff, service corridors running parallel to principal rooms, basement kitchens positioned to minimize the distance food traveled before reaching the dining room while keeping cooking smells and heat away from living spaces. The final plans, approved in 1852, called for a house of staggering ambition. Over 200 rooms spread across multiple floors. Construction began in 1852. The workforce assembled slowly, drawn from surrounding villages and brought in from farther afield. Stonemasons from Italy, skilled in the Florentine techniques Paxton's design required. Carpenters from London, bricklayers from Birmingham, labourers from the fields who needed steady wages and were willing to break their backs for them. At the peak of construction, over 400 men worked the site. The pace was relentless. Stone arrived by wagon from quarries in Bath and Portland, each block cut to precise dimensions, each surface dressed smooth. Paxton's design called for symmetry and proportion that left no room for error. Scaffolding rose around the central tower. Mortar mixed in enormous batches. Pulleys hauled limestone blocks into place while men balanced on planks 30 feet above the ground, setting each stone with hammers and chisels, their hands raw, their lungs thick with dust. The Italian masons were paid the highest wages, sometimes as much as 6 shillings a day, because their skills were rare and essential. They understood how to cut stone so it would weather properly, how to set voussoirs in an arch so the structure would lock itself under compression, how to carve ornamental details that would survive English winters. They worked in teams, often family groups who had practiced the craft for generations. Their presence on site was a source of tension. Local workers resented the foreigners taking premium positions. Language barriers complicated instructions. But Paxton insisted on quality, and quality demanded expertise. Below the skilled craftsmen came the laborers. Men who hauled stone, mixed mortar, carried water, cleared debris, and dug foundations. They earned between 2 and 3 shillings a day, barely enough to feed a family. The work was dangerous. Ropes frayed. Scaffolding collapsed. Stone blocks slipped from pulleys. Men fell. Injuries were common. Crushed fingers, broken bones, burns from lime mortar that ate through skin. Medical care was minimal. A man too injured to work was dismissed. There was always another body willing to take his place. The hours were brutal. Summer days stretched from first light to dusk, sometimes 14 hours of continuous labor. Winter brought shorter days but no reduction in expectations. Men worked in cold that numbed fingers and made tools slippery. Frost complicated mortar work. Rain turned the site into mud. Still, the schedule held. Mayer wanted the house completed within 3 years, an ambitious timeline for a structure of this scale. Temporary housing was erected for workers who came from a distance. Rough wooden barracks, unheated, shared by a dozen men or more. Straw mattresses. A communal fire for cooking. Conditions that would have appalled the people who would eventually dine in Mentmore's gilded rooms. The workers ate simple food, bread and cheese, occasional meat, weak beer. They rose before dawn and fell into exhausted sleep after dark. Accidents were recorded sporadically. Estate ledgers mentioned compensation paid to widows. Small sums, a few pounds, offered without admission of responsibility. The work continued regardless. While the facade climbed toward the sky, another construction unfolded beneath it. Mentmore required infrastructure most English country houses still lacked. Central heating fed by coal-fired boilers in basement chambers the size of small warehouses. Gas lighting throughout, piped from a dedicated gasworks on the estate. Running water, hot and cold, delivered to bathrooms and service rooms through a network of copper pipes threaded through walls and under floors. Servants' corridors ran parallel to the grand halls, allowing staff to move unseen. Service staircases, narrow and steep, connected basement kitchens to upper floors so food arrived hot and servants stayed invisible. These hidden arteries made the house function, but they were designed with the explicit intention that guests would never notice them. The beauty upstairs depended entirely on the machinery below, and the machinery depended entirely on the people who operated it. The heating system alone represented a feat of engineering that pushed Victorian technology to its limits. Twin boilers, each weighing several tons, were installed in vaulted basement chambers with walls thick enough to contain an explosion should anything go catastrophically wrong. Cast iron pipes, some as wide as a man's thigh, carried hot water through the building, branching into progressively smaller pipes that fed radiators in every major room. The system required constant monitoring. Water levels, pressure, fuel consumption engineers were employed full-time to keep the machinery operating smoothly. The gasworks sat in a separate building several hundred feet from the main house, close enough for efficiency, far enough to reduce fire risk. Coal was heated in sealed retorts, producing gas that was piped through underground lines to the mansion. Inside, gas jets were fitted with ceramic mantles that glowed when lit, providing illumination far superior to candles or oil lamps. The system required regular maintenance. Pipes leaked, mantles cracked, gas pressure had to be regulated or lights would flare and smoke. A dedicated gas fitter lived on the estate, responsible for keeping the entire network functional. Water posed another challenge. The site had no natural springs sufficient for a house this size. Engineers drilled wells and installed pumping equipment to lift water into elevated tanks hidden in the attic. Gravity then fed the system, delivering water to bathrooms, kitchens, and service areas throughout the building. Hot water was produced in basement boilers separate from the heating system, stored in insulated tanks, and piped where needed. For the era, this represented extraordinary luxury. Most country houses still relied on servants hauling water in jugs and pitchers. The servants' circulation system was equally elaborate. Paxton designed the house so staff could move from basement to attic without ever crossing a principal room or public corridor. Narrow staircases, steep and unadorned, allowed maids to reach bedrooms to clean and lay fires. Service corridors connected kitchens to dining rooms. Back entrances gave access to storage areas and coal cellars. The goal was invisibility. Guests should see fires blazing, meals arriving, rooms spotless, without ever glimpsing the labor that produced these effects. The basement was a city beneath the house. Kitchens, sculleries, laundries, storage rooms. Mentmore opened in 1855. The house party Mayer hosted to celebrate was carefully curated. Guests included members of parliament, fellow financiers, minor European nobility, and a few carefully selected aristocrats willing to attend a Rothschild event. The tour began in the entrance hall, a soaring space lit by a glass-domed ceiling that flooded the room with natural light. Floors were laid with marble. The staircase climbed in a graceful curve, balustrades carved from stone. Visitors moved through the library, the drawing rooms, the dining hall where the table could seat 40 beneath a ceiling painted with Renaissance motifs. Everywhere, art, paintings by old masters, porcelain from Severs and Mason, furniture commissioned from the finest craftsmen in Europe. The message was unmistakable. The Rothschilds understood beauty as well as any duke, and they had the resources to acquire it on a scale few could match. The entrance hall was designed to overwhelm. Guests stepped through the front door and found themselves in a space that rose 40 feet to the glass dome above. Light poured down, reflecting off polished marble floors in geometric patterns of white, grey, and rose. The staircase dominated the far wall, splitting into twin flights that curved upward to a landing before continuing to the first floor. Each baluster was carved from stone, each newel post topped with ornamental finials. The effect was theatrical, a deliberate echo of Italian palazzos, where staircases served as stages for arrival and departure. From the entrance hall, guests moved into the library. Walls lined floor to ceiling with books, thousands of volumes bound in leather, many illuminated manuscripts and rare editions Mayer had collected over decades. The ceiling was coffered and painted, each panel decorated with botanical motifs. Furniture was arranged for conversation and reading, deep chairs upholstered in velvet, tables inlaid with marquetry, lamps positioned to cast light without glare. This was Mayer's sanctuary, the room that announced his intellectual credentials, proof that banking wealth could appreciate culture as deeply as inherited privilege. The drawing rooms followed, a sequence of interconnected spaces that could be opened or closed depending on the size of the gathering. Silk wallpaper in muted golds and greens. Fireplaces of carved marble, each mantel topped with porcelain clocks and bronze sculptures. Paintings covered the walls, portraits, landscapes, religious scenes by Dutch and Italian masters. The furniture was French, much of it Louis XV and 5 pieces acquired at auction or through dealers. Every object was chosen for quality and provenance. Nothing was accidental. The dining room was Paxton's masterpiece of proportion. The table, when fully extended, could seat 40 guests. The ceiling soared 20 feet, painted with allegorical figures and gilded trim. Windows along one wall overlooked the estate's gardens. Crystal chandeliers hung at intervals, their prisms catching light and scattering it across the room. Place settings were Sevres porcelain, silverware carried the Rothschild crest, glassware came from Venetian makers. Guests praised everything. They admired the architecture, marveled at the technology, envied the art. But beneath the compliments, the old barriers remained. The Rothschilds had built magnificently. They had not yet built their way inside. Mayer built Mentmore for his wife, Hannah. She was a Rothschild herself, his cousin, part of the family's deliberate strategy of intermarriage to keep wealth concentrated within the clan. Hannah moved through Mentmore's rooms with quiet authority. She oversaw the household, managed the staff, planned dinners and entertainments with precision. But she also understood, perhaps more clearly than Mayer, that no amount of architectural splendor would fully erase the barriers they faced. English society admired the house, envied the art, and attended the parties, but acceptance remained conditional. Hannah kept detailed records, correspondence preserved in archives, that reveal a woman aware of the performance required to maintain their position. Every dinner was a negotiation, every guest list a calculation. The house was beautiful. The house was also exhausting. Hannah's daily routine revolved around management. She rose early, often before 7, and met with the housekeeper to review the day's activities. Menus required approval. Guest rooms needed preparation if visitors were expected. Linens were inspected for wear. Floors checked for scuffs. Silver counted and polished. Every detail mattered because every detail was visible, and visibility meant judgment. Hannah understood that the house was always on display, that servants gossiped, that guests reported back to their own circles, that any lapse in standards would be noted and interpreted as proof that the Rothschilds were not quite up to the task of maintaining a great estate. Her correspondence reveals the strain. Letters to her sister-in-law describe the constant pressure of entertaining, the need to invite the right people in the right combinations, the careful balancing of political affiliations, social hierarchies, family obligations. A dinner party was never just a dinner party. It was an opportunity to build alliances, to demonstrate taste, to signal that the Rothschilds belonged among England's elite. But it was also a minefield. Seat the wrong guest next to the wrong neighbor and offense could linger for years. Serve food that was too rich and you were vulgar, too simple and you were cheap. The margin for error was narrow. Hannah also managed the emotional labor of being perpetually watched. Jewish families in her position faced scrutiny that Christian aristocrats never encountered. Every expenditure was noted. Every piece of jewelry commented upon. If the Rothschilds spent lavishly, they were accused of flaunting wealth. If they were restrained, they were suspected of miserliness. Hannah navigated these contradictions with skill, but the effort took its toll. Her letters mentioned fatigue, headaches, the strain of maintaining a facade of effortless grace. She was also deeply involved in charitable work, a requirement for women of her class, but particularly important for Jewish families seeking social acceptance. Hannah supported hospitals, orphanages, and schools. She hosted fundraising events at Mentmore. She served on committees. This work was genuine. Hannah believed in helping those less fortunate, but it was also strategic. Philanthropy softened the family's image, countered accusations of greed, and provided opportunities to build relationships with influential figures who might otherwise keep their distance. Yet beneath all the activity, a question lingered. Was it worth it? The endless performance, the scrutiny, the knowledge that no matter how perfect the execution, true acceptance might never come. Mentmore employed over 60 full-time servants. Housemaids rose before dawn to lay fires in the principal rooms, scrub grates and dust furniture. Footmen served meals, answered bells, and maintained the public spaces. Cooks and kitchen staff worked in basement kitchens where heat from coal ranges made summer unbearable. Laundresses handled mountains of linens. Groundskeepers managed the estate's gardens and drives. Each position came with defined duties, strict hierarchies, and limited freedoms. Wages varied. A head housekeeper might earn £40 a year plus room and board. A scullery maid earned 12. The work was hard, the hours long, and dismissal could come swiftly for errors or insubordination. The Rothschilds were considered fair employers by the standards of the era, but fair still meant a system where workers had almost no leverage and their entire livelihoods depended on pleasing people who would never know what it felt like to polish silver for 10 hours straight. The hierarchy below stairs was as rigid as anything upstairs. At the top sat the butler and housekeeper, positions of real authority. The butler controlled the male staff, managed the wine cellars, oversaw service at meals, and acted as Mayer's representative in household matters. The housekeeper commanded the female staff, controlled household supplies, and answered directly to Hannah. Both positions required years of experience, impeccable references, and an ability to manage large teams under pressure. They were well paid by servant standards and enjoyed privileges like private rooms and better food. Beneath them came the upper servants, valets, ladies' maids, the head cook, the head gardener. These positions required specialized skills. A valet dressed his employer, maintained wardrobes, and often traveled with the family. A lady's maid performed similar duties for female family members, including complex hairdressing and corsetry. The head cook commanded the kitchen, planned menus, and oversaw a brigade that could include sous chefs, pastry cooks, and kitchen maids. These servants ate separately from the lower staff and were addressed with a measure of respect. The lower servants formed the base of the pyramid. Housemaids, footmen, kitchen maids, scullery maids, hallboys. These positions were filled by young people, often teenagers, who worked the longest hours for the lowest pay. A housemaid's day began at 5 in the morning. She lit fires in bedrooms and principal rooms, a task that required carrying coal, cleaning grates, laying kindling, and ensuring fires caught without smoking. She then scrubbed floors, dusted furniture, changed linens, emptied chamber pots, and prepared rooms for the day. By the time family and guests woke, her most visible work had to be complete. She remained available throughout the day to answer bells, tidy rooms, and assist upper servants. Scullery maids had it worst. They worked in basement kitchens washing dishes, scrubbing pots, and cleaning floors. The heat was crushing. Coal ranges kept the kitchen at temperatures that made breathing difficult. Water had to be hauled, heated, and poured. Their hands were perpetually raw from lye soap and scalding water. They ate last, slept in the coldest rooms, and were the first dismissed if cutbacks became necessary. Their position offered no prospects for advancement. Operating Mentmore was staggeringly expensive. Coal alone consumed hundreds of pounds annually. Food, linens, candles, lamp oil, repairs, wages, the expenses never stopped. Mayer's banking income was more than sufficient to cover costs, but the scale still demanded constant attention. Every system required maintenance. Heating pipes leaked. Roof slates cracked in winter storms. Plaster developed hairline fractures that needed patching before they spread. Upholstery faded. Carpets wore thin in high-traffic areas. The house was not static. It was a living organism that consumed resources and demanded care. The Rothschilds could afford it, but affordability did not mean the burden was light. Every month, ledgers recorded the outflow. Every year, the totals climbed. The dream of permanence required a foundation of constant expenditure that most families, even wealthy ones, could not sustain. Estate account books, preserved in archives, reveal the scale of expenditure with brutal precision. Coal deliveries arrived weekly during winter, sometimes multiple tons per week to feed the heating system and kitchen ranges. Annual coal costs ran to several £100s, equivalent to many thousands today. Gas for lighting consumed another substantial sum. The estate's gasworks required coal for production, maintenance for equipment, and wages for the gas fitter who kept the system operational. Food provisioning was equally expensive. Mentmore maintained a large household family, guests, and over 60 servants, all of whom required feeding daily. The kitchens ordered supplies in bulk, Flour by the hundredweight, sugar in massive cones, butter in firkins, meat delivered by local butchers multiple times weekly. Wine cellars were stocked with hundreds of bottles, some acquired at significant expense from French vineyards. Spirits, liqueurs, and champagne for entertaining guests represented another line item. The monthly food bill ran to hundreds of pounds. Wages formed the largest fixed cost. 60 servants at an average of £20 per year, though many earned more. Some less meant an annual wage bill exceeding £1,200, plus the cost of housing and feeding them. The butler and housekeeper commanded salaries that reached £50 to £60. Specialized positions like the head gardener or estate manager drew similar figures. These were not optional expenses. A house this size could not function without substantial staff. Repairs and maintenance demanded constant investment. Stone buildings require vigilant care. Water penetration destroys masonry from within. Roof slates crack under freeze-thaw cycles. Mortar joints deteriorate and need repointing. Windows leak. Lead flashing fails. Paxton's innovative glass dome above the entrance hall, while spectacular, proved difficult to maintain. Seals degraded. Condensation caused problems. Repairs required specialized glaziers and scaffolding that turned simple fixes into expensive projects. Interior maintenance was equally demanding. Carpets wore through in high traffic areas and had to be replaced or rotated. Upholstery faded from sunlight and required recovering. Wallpaper stained or tore and needed replacement. Gilding tarnished. Painted ceilings developed cracks. Furniture joints loosened. Porcelain chipped. Every object required care, and care required money. The total annual operating cost ran to several £1,000s, a figure that would only increase as systems aged and required more intensive maintenance. Mayer absorbed these costs without visible strain, but the structure was inherently unsustainable. Mayer died in 1874. He was 55 years old, still vigorous, still managing the family's banking interests. His death was sudden, and it left Mentmore to Hannah and their daughter, also named Hannah, who had married Lord Rosebery, a rising figure in British politics. The younger Hannah inherited the house, its contents, and the social position her father had worked so hard to construct. But she also inherited the costs and the contradictions. Rosebery was ambitious. He would eventually become Prime Minister. But his political career was shadowed by whispers about his wife's money, the Rothschild fortune that funded his estates and campaigns. Mentmore remained magnificent, but its meaning had shifted. It was no longer just a statement of arrival. It was a reminder that even marriage to a Scottish earl could not fully erase the fact that the money was Jewish, foreign, and still viewed by some as tainted. Mayer's death sent shockwaves through the Rothschild network. He had been a central figure in the London banking house, managing investments and maintaining relationships with government ministers, railway companies, and industrial concerns across Europe. His sudden absence created a vacuum that took years to fill. Professionally, the family managed. The Rothschild banking empire was structured to survive individual losses. Cousins stepped in. Responsibilities were redistributed. The business continued. Personally, the loss devastated Hannah. She withdrew from society for the prescribed mourning period, a year of black crepe and restricted activity. When she emerged, she found herself in an uncomfortable position. As a widow, she had control over Mentmore and its income, but she also faced expectations about what a woman of her age and station should do. She was in her 50s, wealthy, but without a defined role. Her daughter had her own household at Mentmore after marrying Rosebery. Hannah the elder became a guest in the house she had helped create. The younger Hannah's marriage to Archibald Primrose, the 5th Earl of Rosebery, had seemed a triumph when it occurred in 1878. Rosebery was brilliant, ambitious, heir to an ancient Scottish title and estates. The match appeared to be everything Mayer had wanted, a connection to the British aristocracy that went beyond business relationships. But the marriage came with complications. Rosebery's family had initially resisted. The idea of an earl marrying a Rothschild, even one of enormous wealth, troubled those who believed bloodlines should remain pure. Rosebery persisted, driven partly by genuine affection and partly by financial necessity. His estates were encumbered with debt. Hannah's dowry was staggering, reportedly several £100,000, enough to clear his obligations and fund his political ambitions. The whispers began almost immediately. Rosebery's rise in Liberal Party politics was meteoric. He served in Gladstone's cabinets, became Foreign Secretary, and in 1894 became Prime Minister. At every step, opponents and critics noted that his wife's money greased the wheels. Campaign expenses, entertaining, maintaining estates all funded by Rothschild wealth. The anti-Semitic press was vicious. Cartoons depicted Rosebery as a puppet controlled by Jewish financiers. Political opponents questioned whether he could govern independently when his fortune came from the Rothschilds. By the early 20th century, Mentmore had become a problem. The younger Hannah died in 1890. Rosebery kept the house but spent less and less time there. Operating costs remained high. Staff numbers could not be reduced without letting the house deteriorate. The estate, once a symbol of vitality, began to feel like a burden. Rosebery's children inherited it with even less attachment. They had other properties, other lives. Mentmore sat largely empty through the interwar years. Maintenance was deferred. Rooms were closed. Dust gathered on surfaces that had once gleamed. The house that Mayer built to prove permanence was slowly being abandoned by the very family that had created it. The dream was dying not from violence or catastrophe, but from neglect, from the quiet decision that it was no longer worth the trouble. Hannah's death in 1890 at the age of 39 shocked everyone. She had been in apparent good health, active in managing Mentmore and supporting Rosebery's political career. The cause of death was listed as Bright's disease, a kidney condition that progressed rapidly. Her funeral was elaborate, attended by political figures and members of high society. She was buried with full honors, but her death created an immediate practical problem. What to do with Mentmore? Rosebery inherited the house under the terms of Mayer's original bequest, which had passed it to Hannah for her lifetime and then to her heirs. Rosebery had no personal attachment to the building. It was not his ancestral home. It represented his wife's family, her money, her legacy. He maintained it minimally for several years, but his attention was elsewhere. His political career continued. He remarried. His children by Hannah grew up and established their own households. Mentmore became one property among many, and not the one he cared most about. Staff numbers began to fall. Retirements were not replaced. Positions were combined. The house could no longer support the elaborate entertaining it had been designed for, so rooms were closed off. Furniture was covered with dust sheets. Shutters were drawn. Entire wings went dark. The heating system, expensive to operate, was run only in sections of the house that were actively used. The rest was allowed to grow cold and damp, conditions disastrous for a building filled with art, books, and antique furniture. Maintenance became reactive rather than preventive. Repairs were made only when something failed completely. A leaking roof was patched rather than replaced. Broken windows were boarded rather than reglazed. The gardens, once meticulously maintained, were simplified. Ornamental plantings gave way to grass. The kitchen gardens were reduced. Greenhouses fell into disrepair. The grounds still looked respectable from a distance, but up close the decay was visible. By the 1920s, Mentmore was a shadow of its former self. The house still stood, the architecture still impressive, but it felt abandoned. Visitors remarked on the silence, the emptiness, the sense that something vital had departed. Rosebery's children, inheriting the property after his death in 1929, faced a decision. Maintain an expensive, outdated house they had no emotional connection to, or let it go. They chose the latter, slowly but unmistakably. In 1977, the decision was made. Mentmore would be sold. The contents would be auctioned. Sotheby's was hired to catalogue and sell everything inside: paintings, furniture, porcelain, books, carpets, chandeliers. The sale lasted 3 days. Buyers came from around the world. Museums competed for key pieces. Private collectors bid against institutions. The Fabergé egg went for a record sum. Renaissance furniture scattered to New York, Paris, Tokyo. The house itself, stripped of its contents, stood empty. The British government considered purchasing it as a national heritage site. Negotiations dragged. No agreement was reached. Mentmore, the palace Mayer built to announce that the Rothschilds belonged, was left to decay. The family, still among the wealthiest on earth, chose profit over preservation. The scandal was not the sale itself, but the message it sent, that even they did not believe the house was worth saving. The announcement of the sale sent shockwaves through Britain's heritage community. Mentmore was not just any country house. It was a landmark, a supreme example of Victorian architecture and craftsmanship, filled with objects of museum quality. The National Trust expressed interest in acquiring it. Historic preservation organizations lobbied the government to intervene, but the process was slow, complicated by politics, budgets, and bureaucratic inertia. Meanwhile, Sotheby's moved forward with cataloguing. Teams of specialists descended on Mentmore to assess, photograph, and describe every item. The catalogue, when published, ran to hundreds of pages. Paintings by Rubens, Reynolds, and Gainsborough. Furniture attributed to the greatest French ébénistes. Sèvres porcelain services that had belonged to Louis XVI. Gobelin's tapestries, rare books and manuscripts. Fabergé objects including the famous egg. The aggregate value was estimated in the millions, possibly tens of millions. The sale opened on May 18, 1977. Bidders filled the rooms. Telephones connected remote buyers. The atmosphere was electric. Lot by lot, Mentmore's interiors were dismantled. The Fabergé eggs sold for a record price, snapped up by a private collector. Major paintings went to museums. Furniture dealers competed for the finest pieces. By the end of 3 days, virtually nothing remained. The house was empty. The British government's attempt to purchase Mentmore collapsed amid political wrangling. The asking price was deemed too high. Questions arose about operating costs. Would it become a museum? Who would manage it? How would it be funded? No consensus emerged. Negotiations dragged on for months and then quietly died. The Rothschild family, through the estate of the late Earl of Rosebery's descendants, moved forward with a private sale of the building itself. The decision sparked outrage. Critics accused the family of betrayal, of abandoning a national treasure for profit. The Rothschilds, still among the wealthiest families in the world, clearly did not need the money. The sale appeared to be driven by convenience, by a desire to shed a burdensome asset. The symbolism was devastating. Mayer had built Mentmore to prove that his family deserved a permanent place in English society. A century later, his descendants proved that even they believed permanence was an illusion. Today, Mentmore Towers stands in private hands, converted into luxury apartments. The grand rooms are divided. The entrance hall still soars, but it serves a different function now. Residents come and go. The staff quarters are silent. The servants who once kept the machinery running are long dead, their names unrecorded, their labor forgotten. The house survives, but as a shell, its original purpose erased. Mayer built Mentmore to prove that the Rothschilds deserved a place among England's elite. For a time, it worked. The house was admired. The parties were attended. But acceptance was always conditional, and when the conditions changed, when the tax burden became inconvenient and the house became a liability, the family walked away. The lesson is clear: no amount of beauty, no architectural grandeur can force the world to accept you. And when that acceptance fails to deliver what you hoped, even the most magnificent dreams can be abandoned without a second thought. The conversion to apartments began in the 1980s. Developers purchased the empty building and set about dividing the interior. The entrance hall, protected by preservation orders, remained largely intact, but surrounding rooms were partitioned. Bedrooms became separate units. Drawing rooms were subdivided. Kitchens and bathrooms were installed. Modern heating, electrical, and plumbing systems replaced the Victorian infrastructure that had served for over a century. The work was done with some sensitivity to the architecture, but the fundamental character changed. Mentmore was no longer a unified whole. It was a collection of private spaces, each sealed off from the others. The residents who live there now occupy an odd historical position. They walk through doors Mayer commissioned, climb staircases Paxton designed, sleep in rooms where Victorian aristocrats once entertained. But they experience the building in fragments, divorced from its original context. The library is someone's living room. The dining hall is divided into apartments. The servants' quarters, once crowded with workers, are storage or converted into additional units. The continuity is broken. Outside, the estate has been parceled and sold. The grounds Mayer acquired to create a self-contained world of gardens, parks, and farms have largely passed to other owners. Housing developments encroach. Roads cut through what were once private drives. The isolation that made Mentmore a refuge is gone. The house sits surrounded by modern suburbia, a relic from another era marooned in the present. What remains is evidence. The architecture itself, though altered, still demonstrates Paxton's genius. The entrance hall still soars. The proportions still work. The craftsmanship, where it survives, still impresses. Photographs and records preserve what was lost. The Sotheby's catalogue documents the contents. Archives hold Mayer's correspondence, Hannah's letters, estate ledgers that record the daily operations. Historians can reconstruct the story, even if the building no longer tells it coherently. The lesson Mentmore offers is uncomfortable. Grand houses survive only when someone believes they are worth the cost. Mayer believed. Hannah struggled to maintain that belief. Rosebery did not share it. His descendants cared even less. When the emotional and financial investment required to preserve Mentmore exceeded what the family was willing to give, the house was abandoned.